the height of the 20th century, the United States stood in a position few nations in history had ever reached. Its economy dwarfed those of its rivals, its military spanned oceans, and its confidence was reinforced by recent victories that seemed to confirm a simple belief: American power, when fully unleashed, was unstoppable. From Washington, the world appeared orderly, measurable, and ultimately manageable through planning, resources, and resolve. Vietnam, distant and unfamiliar, entered this worldview not as a nation with its own historical gravity, but as a variable in a much larger equation. To American policymakers, Vietnam was not first understood as a place shaped by centuries of resistance, colonial trauma, and internal struggle. It was interpreted through maps, reports, and Cold War logic. Southeast Asia became a strategic zone, and Vietnam a symbolic line. If it fell, others might follow. This framing reduced a deeply human conflict into an abstract threat, one that demanded response not because of Vietnam itself, but because of what it represented in the global contest between ideologies. The United States did not arrive believing it was stepping into a war of national survival. It arrived believing it was managing a problem. This sense of control was reinforced by numbers that seemed overwhelming. Industrial output, troop capacity, aerial dominance, and technological sophistication all pointed in one direction. American planners spoke the language of efficiency and escalation. If resistance increased, pressure would increase alongside it. If territory was contested, it could be cleared. If the enemy persisted, they could be worn down. Victory was not imagined as uncertain, but as delayed. The only real question appeared to be how much force would be required before the outcome became inevitable. Within this framework, confidence did not feel reckless. It felt earned. The United States had emerged from the Second World War as a decisive force, and the Korean conflict had reinforced the belief that American intervention could halt adversaries and stabilize regions. Military doctrine emphasized mobility, firepower, and rapid response. In Vietnam, these strengths were expected to translate seamlessly. The assumption was not merely that battles could be won, but that winning battles would naturally lead to winning the war. What went largely unexamined was whether the conflict itself operated according to the same rules. American leaders believed that superiority would impose clarity. Yet Vietnam was not a theater that rewarded clarity. It resisted simplification. The terrain, the politics, and the motivations of those fighting could not be neatly categorized. Still, early decisions were guided by the belief that complexity could be solved through scale. If the situation appeared confusing, it meant more resources were needed. If progress was slow, it meant pressure had to increase. This illusion of invincibility was not born from arrogance alone. It was sustained by distance. Vietnam was far enough away that its realities could be filtered, summarized, and reshaped before reaching decision-makers. Reports traveled upward through layers of command, often emphasizing progress, downplaying uncertainty, and translating human experiences into statistics. Villages cleared, enemy casualties counted, sorties flown. Each metric reinforced the impression that control was expanding, even when stability remained elusive. For the American public, the early years carried a similar tone. The war was presented as difficult but manageable, costly but necessary. There was little sense that the outcome itself was in doubt. The narrative focused on commitment rather than consequence, on effort rather than understanding. Vietnam appeared as a proving ground where American resolve would eventually prevail, not as a mirror that might reflect uncomfortable truths about the limits of power. Yet beneath this confidence lay a quiet contradiction. The United States was preparing to fight a war defined by measurable success against an opponent whose strength could not be measured in the same way. The assumption that dominance in resources would translate into dominance in outcome went largely unquestioned. Victory was treated as a function of persistence, not of alignment between means and purpose. This was the foundation upon which the war began, an entry shaped by certainty, framed by confidence, and sustained by the belief that history favored the strong. The United States did not step into Vietnam expecting to be changed by it. It expected to shape it. What followed would challenge not just strategies and tactics, but the very definition of what it meant to win. From the beginning, American strength in Vietnam was defined by scale. Everything about the war was measured, counted, and compared. Troop deployments were tracked with precision, sorties logged by the thousands, and tonnage of bombs calculated down to the last figure. War, in the American system, was something that could be quantified. If power could be expressed in numbers, then victory could be forecast long before it arrived. By the middle of the conflict, the United States had committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Vietnam. These were supported by an industrial machine capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. Aircraft carriers moved effortlessly across the Pacific. Strategic bombers flew from distant bases with mechanical reliability. Supply chains stretched across oceans, yet rarely faltered. No force opposing the United States could match this capacity. On paper, the imbalance was absolute. Technology reinforced this perception. American units operated with advanced communications, air support available within minutes, and weapons designed to overwhelm any conventional opponent. Helicopters transformed mobility, allowing troops to be inserted and extracted with speed no previous army had possessed. Surveillance, sensors, and radar promised awareness of the battlefield that earlier generations could only imagine. The war appeared to be a demonstration of modern warfare against an adversary locked in an earlier age. Military planners believed that such advantages would compress time itself. Battles would be short, resistance would collapse under pressure, and losses on the opposing side would eventually exceed the capacity to replace them. Attrition became a central concept. If the enemy could be forced into enough engagements, mathematics alone would decide the outcome. The war was framed as a test of endurance measured in bodies and material, a test the United States believed it could not lose. This logic shaped operations across Vietnam. Large-scale search and destroy missions were designed to draw opposing forces into open confrontation. When contact occurred, American firepower ensured tactical success. Enemy units were often pushed back, scattered, or destroyed. After each engagement, reports emphasized kill ratios that appeared overwhelmingly favorable. These numbers moved upward through the chain of command, reinforcing the belief that progress was being made. Yet numbers have a way of concealing as much as they reveal. Casualty counts said little about the political or psychological effects of combat. Villages cleared during operations often reverted once forces moved on. Territory controlled during daylight hours did not necessarily remain controlled after dark. The war's geography resisted permanence. Control existed momentarily, then dissolved. Still, metrics continued to suggest forward momentum. The American approach assumed that pressure was cumulative. Each battle won was expected to weaken the enemy irreversibly. But this assumption depended on a critical premise, that the opposing side experienced loss in the same way. In Vietnam, losses were not interpreted through the same strategic lens. The ability to absorb damage, regroup, and continue fighting did not depend on industrial replacement alone. It depended on something less tangible, something that did not appear in charts or briefings. Meanwhile, American strength itself carried hidden costs. The very scale that made operations possible also created distance. Decision-makers relied on summaries rather than lived experience. Reports were filtered through institutional incentives that rewarded optimism and punished uncertainty. Success was defined in ways that aligned with existing doctrine, even when reality failed to conform. As long as numbers moved in the right direction, deeper questions remained unanswered. This emphasis on measurement also shaped how success was communicated at home. Press briefings highlighted statistics meant to reassure. Progress was framed as incremental but steady. The language of inevitability persisted. The United States was investing too much, committing too deeply, to imagine failure as a realistic outcome. Power, once mobilized at such scale, was assumed to impose its will eventually. Yet Vietnam was not a conflict that yielded to accumulation alone. The opposing forces did not rely on holding territory in conventional terms. They did not depend on centralized infrastructure that could be permanently destroyed. Their strategy did not require winning battles in the way American doctrine defined victory. Each engagement was not a step toward resolution, but part of a longer rhythm in which time itself became a weapon. As American commanders continued to measure progress through steel and numbers, a gap widened between perception and reality. The war looked increasingly successful in reports, yet increasingly unstable on the ground. This contradiction did not immediately signal defeat. Instead, it created confusion. How could a war be going well and feel unresolved at the same time? The answer lay in the limits of measurement. The United States had assembled a level of power unmatched in history, but power alone could not dictate meaning. Numbers could describe destruction, but not transformation. Steel could dominate battlefields, but not define outcomes. Vietnam was becoming a place where American strength performed exactly as designed, yet failed to deliver what it promised. This realization would not come all at once. It would emerge gradually through repetition, frustration, and the unsettling persistence of an enemy that refused to disappear. The war was being won repeatedly, and yet it was not moving toward an end. The paradox was taking shape, even if few were ready to name it. On the battlefield itself, American forces rarely lacked success. When engagements unfolded on terms recognizable to conventional doctrine, the outcome was usually decisive. Firepower, coordination, and air support combined to overwhelm opposing units. In many of the war's most intense clashes, American troops held their ground, forced withdrawals, and inflicted heavy losses. By traditional military standards, these encounters were victories. Yet each victory carried an unsettling aftertaste. Once the fighting ended, the sense of resolution never arrived. Units moved on, bases were relocated, and areas declared secured gradually slipped back into uncertainty. Control proved fleeting. What had been won through force could not be held through presence alone. The battlefield reset itself with quiet efficiency, erasing the meaning of triumph almost as soon as it was declared. This pattern repeated across the country. Operations were planned with precision, executed with discipline, and concluded with favorable assessments. Commanders reported success, often supported by impressive statistics. Enemy units had been located and neutralized, weapons caches destroyed, areas swept clean. On maps and in briefings, progress seemed undeniable. Yet beyond those representations, the environment remained unchanged. The problem was not that American forces failed to win engagements. It was that the war did not revolve around engagements in the way American planners expected. Battles were not endpoints, they were interruptions. The opposing side did not seek decisive confrontation unless conditions favored them. They chose when to appear and when to vanish, shaping the rhythm of the conflict rather than reacting to it. American doctrine emphasized momentum. Success was expected to build upon itself and creating pressure that would eventually force a breaking point. In Vietnam, momentum behaved differently. Each engagement consumed resources and attention, but it did not accumulate in a linear way. Victory did not compound. Instead, it dissolved into the surrounding landscape, leaving little behind that could be transformed into lasting advantage. This created a strategic dilemma. The United States could win nearly every fight and still fail to alter the broader trajectory of the war. Tactical excellence did not translate into strategic control. The enemy did not need to defeat American forces outright. They only needed to persist. Survival itself became a form of resistance, one that undermined the meaning of battlefield success. Over time, this disconnect strained the logic of the war. If battles were being won, why did the situation remain unstable? If losses on the opposing side were mounting, why did resistance continue? These questions did not fit neatly into established frameworks. They suggested that something fundamental was being misunderstood, yet the system tasked with answering them relied on the same assumptions that had produced the confusion. For soldiers on the ground, the contradiction was palpable. Patrols moved through areas previously cleared, encountering renewed hostility. Villages that had been secured required repeated operations. The sense of progress felt temporary, fragile, and reversible. Success demanded constant reinforcement, while absence invited erosion. Control existed only as long as it was actively imposed. Meanwhile, leadership continued to interpret events through familiar lenses. Battles were cataloged, lessons learned were refined, and tactics adjusted. Yet these refinements addressed symptoms rather than causes. They improved efficiency within a framework that was increasingly misaligned with reality. The war was not failing because battles were poorly fought. It was failing because battles were not the decisive factor. This realization challenged deeply held beliefs about military power. For generations, American strength had been associated with the ability to impose outcomes through force. In Vietnam, force achieved results without resolution. The enemy adapted not by matching strength, but by redefining the terms of engagement. They transformed the war into something that could be endured rather than won outright. As this pattern solidified, the meaning of victory itself began to blur. Winning a battle no longer guaranteed progress. Success became episodic rather than transformative. Each engagement stood alone, disconnected from a larger narrative of advancement. The war continued not because American forces were ineffective, but because effectiveness did not equate to control. This was the moment when the paradox became unavoidable. The United States was demonstrating extraordinary competence on the battlefield while drifting strategically. Power was being exercised without direction that matched the nature of the conflict. The war was being fought well, yet not in a way that could bring it to an end. What emerged from this phase was not immediate collapse, but growing unease. The gap between action and outcome widened. Confidence persisted, but it was increasingly sustained by repetition rather than clarity. Battles continued to be won, reports continued to affirm progress. Yet the question remained unanswered. How many victories were required before the war itself would change? Vietnam was revealing a difficult truth. Control could not be seized through combat alone. Victory required something beyond dominance in engagements. Until that reality was confronted, the United States would continue to win battles while losing its grip on the war as a whole. What made Vietnam fundamentally different was not simply the enemy, but the shape of the war itself. There were no fixed front lines to cross, no capitals whose capture would signal collapse, no clear boundaries separating battlefield from civilian life. The conflict unfolded everywhere and nowhere at once. Roads, villages, rivers, and jungles all functioned as contested space. Control was temporary, conditional, and constantly challenged. For the United States, this reality undermined the very structure of modern warfare. Military power was designed to seize and hold ground, to advance from one objective to the next. In Vietnam, ground could be taken, but holding it required a permanence that the war refused to grant. The landscape absorbed movement without yielding ownership. American forces could occupy an area during the day, only to find it altered by nightfall. The opposing side understood this environment intimately. They did not need to defend territory in conventional terms. Instead, they embedded themselves within it. Villages were not merely locations on a map, but living networks of relationships, history, and obligation. The war flowed through these networks, invisible to aerial reconnaissance and resistant to disruption. Every operation faced an opponent who did not need to stand and fight to succeed. This absence of front lines created constant uncertainty. American soldiers operated in spaces where danger was indistinguishable from normality. A path used safely one moment could become hostile the next. The lack of clear separation between combatant and civilian blurred ethical, strategic, and psychological boundaries. Warfare became an exercise in anticipation rather than confrontation, in vigilance rather than momentum. Technology, which had offered such promise, struggled to impose clarity. Sensors and surveillance could detect movement, but not intent. Air power could devastate areas, but destruction did not equate to control. The enemy adapted by dispersing, relocating, and waiting. Rather than confronting American strength head-on, they allowed it to expend itself against an environment that could not be subdued. This transformation of space carried profound implications. Each American operation required careful planning and coordination, yet its effects were often limited in duration. Once forces withdrew, influence receded. The war did not progress geographically in a meaningful way. It expanded and contracted, shifted and reappeared, refusing to settle into a stable pattern. The lack of front lines also meant the absence of a clear narrative arc. There was no advancing edge to report, no decisive breakthrough to anticipate. Instead, the war consisted of repeated cycles of engagement and withdrawal. This rhythm eroded the sense of purpose that sustained conventional campaigns. Success felt provisional, always subject to reversal. For commanders, this created an almost impossible challenge. How does one measure progress in a war without boundaries? How does one define success when control cannot be consolidated? The answers often defaulted to familiar metrics, even as those metrics lost relevance. The system continued to evaluate performance through encounters and attrition, despite mounting evidence that these measures did not capture the nature of the conflict. The enemy's strength lay not in their ability to defeat American forces directly, but in their refusal to be pinned down. By avoiding decisive engagement, they denied the United States the opportunity to translate superiority into resolution. The war became a test of adaptation rather than force, a contest of endurance rather than dominance. This dynamic placed American troops in a constant state of reaction. Operations responded to intelligence that was often incomplete or outdated. By the time forces arrived, conditions had shifted. The enemy dictated tempo by choosing when to engage and when to withdraw. Initiative, traditionally a hallmark of strength, became elusive. Over time, the psychological toll of this uncertainty grew. The absence of visible progress eroded morale, even in the presence of repeated tactical success. Soldiers found themselves fighting the same battles in different places, without a sense of forward movement. The war felt circular, resistant to closure. This environment also shaped how the conflict was perceived beyond the battlefield. Without front lines, the war lacked visual markers of advancement. Images conveyed chaos rather than conquest, persistence rather than progress. The narrative of steady improvement became harder to sustain, both within the military and among the public. Vietnam had transformed warfare into something deeply unfamiliar. It exposed the limits of a model built around control and escalation. The United States possessed unmatched capacity to destroy, yet destruction did not produce submission. Power could dominate space temporarily, but it could not redefine it. In this war without front lines, the meaning of strength itself began to shift. Success was no longer determined by how much force could be applied, but by whether force could shape outcomes that endured. The United States continued to fight with extraordinary capability, but the battlefield itself refused to behave as expected. This realization marked a turning point. The war was no longer simply difficult. It was revealing a fundamental mismatch between power and purpose. Until that mismatch was addressed, victories would remain isolated moments, unconnected to a path toward resolution. The war would continue to be fought everywhere, and yet nowhere that truly mattered. As the war stretched onward, a quieter contest began to overshadow everything else. It was not fought with weapons or tactics, but with time. In Vietnam, time did not move evenly for the two sides. It pressed differently, carried different meanings, and imposed unequal costs. What emerged was not simply a military struggle, but a confrontation between two radically different relationships with endurance. For the United States, time was a constraint. The war existed within political cycles, public patience, and strategic expectations shaped by previous conflicts. Each year demanded justification. Each escalation required explanation. Progress needed to be visible, measurable, and defensible. The longer the war continued without resolution, the heavier these demands became. Time was something to be managed, something that threatened to erode support if not controlled. Vietnam approached time from a different horizon. The conflict was not framed as a campaign with an endpoint, but as part of a longer historical continuum. Resistance had shaped national memory for generations. Struggle was not measured in months or years, but in persistence across lifetimes. There was no expectation of speed, only of survival. Time was not an enemy to defeat, but a space to inhabit. This asymmetry changed everything. American strategy depended on the belief that pressure would accumulate faster on the opposing side than on its own society. Yet, the opposite gradually became true. Each additional year strained the United States politically and psychologically. Meanwhile, the opposing forces absorbed loss without allowing it to redefine their purpose. Endurance itself became a strategic advantage. American soldiers rotated in and out of Vietnam on fixed schedules. They arrived with defined terms of service and left knowing their time was limited. This system preserved manpower and morale in theory, but it fractured continuity. Experience was constantly lost and relearned. The war never fully belonged to those fighting it, because no one remained long enough to see it change. For the opposing side, continuity was absolute. Fighters remained embedded within the same environment, the same communities, the same objectives. Losses were devastating, but replacement did not require reinvention. Knowledge accumulated slowly and organically. The war was not an interruption to life, it was life. This difference extended beyond the battlefield. In the United States, the war competed with other priorities. Economic concerns, social movements, and political divisions all demanded attention. Vietnam was one issue among many, even as it consumed enormous resources. Its meaning was debated, questioned, and reinterpreted constantly. Consensus was fragile. In Vietnam, the war dominated existence. It shaped daily decisions, long-term hopes, and collective identity. The absence of alternatives concentrated focus. There was no parallel conversation about whether the war was worth continuing. The question had already been answered by history. The only remaining uncertainty was how long it would take. As time passed, the psychological burden shifted. American leaders faced growing pressure to demonstrate progress. Each year, without decisive change, raised doubts about strategy and competence. The war became a test not just of military capability, but of political credibility. Promises made early in the conflict became liabilities later on. Meanwhile, the opposing side understood that persistence itself was destabilizing. They did not need to defeat American forces outright. They needed to remain. Each year that passed without resolution weakened the logic of American involvement. Endurance was transformed into leverage. Time, once assumed to favor superior resources, began to favor those willing to wait. This inversion unsettled traditional assumptions about power. The United States could escalate faster, strike harder, and deploy more widely. But it could not extend its tolerance for uncertainty indefinitely. The war demanded answers that the structure of American society struggled to provide. How long was too long? How much was enough? What did victory actually require? Vietnam did not need to answer these questions in the same way. The absence of a deadline became its strength. The willingness to absorb hardship without redefining purpose created a form of resilience that external pressure could not easily break. Time did not exhaust resolve. It reinforced it. As years accumulated, the contrast sharpened. What had once appeared as patience on one side and urgency on the other evolved into fatigue and steadiness. The United States continued to apply force with precision and intensity, yet each application felt increasingly disconnected from a broader sense of progress. The war moved forward in days and operations, but backward in confidence. This was not a failure of courage or commitment. It was a collision between different temporal realities. One side fought a war that needed to end. The other fought a war that only needed to continue. In such a contest, strength was not measured by speed or scale, but by the ability to endure without transformation. Vietnam revealed that time itself could be a weapon, not one that destroyed, but one that wore down assumptions, narratives, and resolve. The longer the war lasted, the clearer this truth became. Power could dominate moments, but endurance shaped outcomes. By the time this realization began to take hold within American leadership, it was already embedded in the structure of the conflict. The war had become less about winning and more about lasting. In that domain, the balance was shifting decisively. The United States was still winning battles. It still possessed overwhelming strength. But the war was no longer being decided by force alone. It was being decided by who could remain unchanged the longest. And in that silent contest, time was no longer on America's side. While the fighting continued thousands of miles away, another conflict was unfolding inside the United States itself. This battle did not involve armies or territories, yet it would prove just as decisive. It took place in living rooms, college campuses, newsrooms, and the halls of government. Gradually, Vietnam ceased to be only a distant war and became a deeply personal question for American society. For the first time in modern history, a war entered American homes in near real time. Television brought images that were raw and unsettling, stripped of the heroic framing that had defined earlier conflicts. Footage did not show triumphant advances or clear victories. It showed exhaustion, confusion, and suffering. The gap between official statements and visible reality widened, and with it grew skepticism. Trust, once assumed, now required proof. Journalists no longer relied solely on military briefings. They reported what they saw. Battles that had been described as successes appeared chaotic on screen. Claims of progress collided with images of continued violence. This exposure altered the relationship between the public and the war. Vietnam was no longer an abstract cause defended by distant leaders. It became a lived experience mediated through constant visibility. As awareness grew, so did dissent. Protests spread across universities and cities, drawing in students, veterans, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. Opposition did not emerge from a single ideology. It came from moral concern, political frustration, and growing disbelief that the war's costs matched its purpose. Vietnam became a focal point for broader anxieties about authority, truth, and accountability. This internal division placed American leadership under unprecedented strain. Every decision was scrutinized, not only for its strategic impact, but for its political consequences. Escalation risked further unrest. De-escalation risked appearing weak. The war could no longer be managed purely as a military endeavor. It had become inseparable from domestic stability. The release of classified documents intensified this crisis. Revelations that officials had privately doubted the war's prospects while publicly expressing confidence shattered remaining trust. The conflict was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about whether citizens could believe their own government. Credibility, once damaged, proved difficult to restore. For soldiers returning home, the contrast was jarring. They came back from a war still unresolved into a society increasingly divided about its meaning. Service was no longer universally celebrated. Silence often replaced recognition. The war left marks not only on those who fought it, but on how the nation understood sacrifice itself. Politically, Vietnam reshaped the calculus of leadership. Elections became referendums on the war. Promises of resolution carried enormous weight. The conflict influenced decisions far beyond foreign policy, affecting legislation, social movements, and the tone of public discourse. Vietnam was no longer confined to Asia. It had embedded itself in the American identity. This internal struggle weakened the foundation upon which prolonged war depended. Sustained conflict requires shared purpose. In the United States, that consensus fractured. Each year of continued fighting deepened divisions, making unified commitment increasingly elusive. The question was no longer whether the war could be won militarily, but whether it could be sustained politically. Meanwhile, the opposing side understood this dynamic with clarity. They did not need to influence American battlefields to affect outcomes. They needed only to persist. Every year, the war continued, amplified internal pressure within the United States. Endurance abroad translated into erosion at home. The contrast between external strength and internal doubt grew sharper. The United States remained capable of immense military action, yet its willingness to bear the associated costs diminished. Power without consensus became unstable. Decisions slowed. Objectives blurred. The war drifted. Vietnam thus became a turning point in how Americans perceived war itself. It challenged assumptions about authority, patriotism, and moral clarity. The belief that military superiority guaranteed legitimacy was shaken. The idea that governments always spoke honestly in wartime was questioned. These shifts extended far beyond the conflict itself. By the later years, it was clear that the outcome of the war would not be decided solely in jungles or villages. It would be shaped by debates, protests, elections, and public trust. The battlefield had expanded, and on this new front, advantages of firepower meant little. The United States was still fighting effectively overseas. But at home, the foundations that sustained prolonged war were eroding. The conflict had revealed a vulnerability no weapon could address. Strength could compel action, but it could not manufacture belief. This internal battle did not end abruptly. It accumulated quietly, steadily altering the environment in which decisions were made. Vietnam had become more than a foreign war. It had become a test of the American system itself. And in that test, certainty was giving way to doubt. As the war moved into its final phase, the contradiction at its core became impossible to ignore. The United States had not suffered a decisive military collapse. Its forces were still capable, its command structure intact, its ability to project power undiminished. Yet the direction of the war was no longer driven by the pursuit of victory, but by the search for an exit that could be justified, explained, and survived politically. The language surrounding the war began to change. Terms like escalation and progress gave way to phrases such as transition, reduction, and responsibility. The focus shifted from defeating the enemy to reshaping the conditions of departure. Military operations continued, sometimes with the same intensity as before, but their purpose had altered. They were no longer steps toward a clear end state. They were measures designed to manage perception and buy time. This was not retreat in the traditional sense. American forces were not pushed back by an overwhelming enemy advance. There was no battlefield moment that forced surrender. Instead, withdrawal emerged from a slow recognition that continued engagement no longer served a coherent goal. The war had become something that could not be resolved on terms acceptable to American society, regardless of military capability. Efforts were made to redefine success. The emphasis turned toward transferring responsibility, building local capacity, and creating the appearance of stability. These initiatives were presented as pathways to a sustainable outcome, yet they carried an implicit admission. The original vision of decisive victory had been abandoned. What remained was damage control, framed as strategy. For those watching from afar, the end of American involvement appeared paradoxical. How could a nation that won so many battles leave without achieving its objectives? How could such overwhelming power conclude its longest war without clear resolution? The answer lay not in defeat, but in exhaustion of purpose. The war no longer aligned with the political, moral, or strategic realities of the United States. On the other side, victory arrived without celebration. The cost had been immense. Losses were measured not only in lives, but in generations shaped by conflict. Infrastructure lay damaged, communities fractured, and the path forward uncertain. The end of foreign involvement did not bring immediate peace or prosperity. It brought silence, followed by the daunting task of rebuilding. This contrast defined the war's conclusion. One side withdrew without being beaten in the field. The other prevailed without the triumph that victory is often imagined to bring. There were no clear winners in the emotional sense, only outcomes shaped by endurance rather than conquest. For American veterans, the war ended without closure. They returned from a conflict that faded from public attention even as it remained vivid in memory. There was no parade marking victory, no shared narrative that explained sacrifice. The war slipped into history unresolved, its meaning contested rather than affirmed. Politically, the withdrawal left scars that endured for decades. It altered how future conflicts were approached, how risks were calculated, and how public consent was sought. Vietnam became a reference point, invoked whenever intervention was debated. It was not remembered as a defeat, yet it was never remembered as a success. It occupied an uneasy space between. Internationally, the war reshaped perceptions of American power. The United States remained strong, but it was no longer viewed as infallible. The belief that technological and economic superiority could guarantee outcomes had been challenged. Other nations took note. Power could impose presence, but not always permanence. Vietnam's victory was defined not by domination, but by survival. It had outlasted a force far stronger in conventional terms. It had absorbed punishment without surrendering its objective. Yet this achievement came at a cost that defied celebration. The nation emerged unified, but deeply wounded. The end of the war did not resolve its questions. Instead, it left them suspended. What does it mean to win? Can battles matter if they do not shape outcomes? How should power be measured when its limits become visible? These questions lingered long after the final withdrawal. The war concluded not with a decisive moment, but with a gradual fading. It ended without clarity, without catharsis, and without consensus. For the United States, leaving Vietnam marked the end of an era defined by certainty. For Vietnam, it marked the beginning of a long recovery shaped by sacrifice. In this ending, the paradox reached its fullest expression. The United States departed undefeated on the battlefield, yet changed by the experience. Vietnam emerged victorious, yet burdened by the cost. The war had delivered its outcome not through decisive confrontation, but through persistence. And in that outcome, traditional definitions of victory no longer applied. When the Vietnam War finally receded into history, it did not settle into a single comfortable interpretation. Instead, it lingered as a question. It resisted simplification. It refused to become a story of clear triumph or obvious failure. What it offered instead was something far more unsettling, a redefinition of power itself. For the United States, Vietnam marked the end of an era in which strength was assumed to be self-explanatory. Before Vietnam, power was often understood in tangible terms: industrial capacity, military reach, economic dominance. These were the measures that had shaped victory in earlier conflicts. Vietnam did not erase those strengths, but it exposed their limits. It demonstrated that power could be overwhelming and still insufficient, precise and still misaligned, dominant and still unable to impose a desired outcome. The war forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Winning battles did not guarantee control. Control did not guarantee legitimacy. Legitimacy did not guarantee endurance. Each link in the chain could break, and in Vietnam, several did. The United States had entered the war believing that success was a matter of application. It left understanding that success was also a matter of context, consent, and comprehension. This realization reshaped American strategy long after the war ended. Future interventions were filtered through the memory of Vietnam. Questions that once seemed secondary moved to the center. What is the objective? How does it align with local realities? How long will it take? What costs will be borne at home as well as abroad? Vietnam became less a historical event than a cautionary lens. Culturally, the war altered how Americans spoke about conflict. Certainty gave way to skepticism. Heroic narratives became more complicated, layered with ambiguity and moral tension. Popular culture reflected this shift, portraying war not as a clean contest between right and wrong, but as a human experience marked by confusion, loss, and contradiction. Vietnam entered the American consciousness not as a victory to celebrate or a defeat to mourn, but as a reckoning. For Vietnam, the legacy carried a different weight. Survival confirmed the power of collective endurance, yet it also revealed the price such endurance demanded. Victory did not erase suffering. It did not undo loss. It did not restore what had been destroyed. Instead, it left behind a nation tasked with rebuilding amid the memory of prolonged sacrifice. The meaning of victory was inseparable from its cost. Internationally, the war altered the global understanding of asymmetry. It showed that smaller, less equipped forces could resist dominant powers by refusing to fight on prescribed terms. It demonstrated that wars are shaped as much by politics, culture, and psychology as by weapons. This lesson echoed far beyond Southeast Asia, influencing conflicts and strategies across the world. Perhaps the most enduring impact of Vietnam lies in how it complicated the idea of inevitability. Before the war, American power carried an assumption of outcome. After Vietnam, outcome required explanation. Strength still mattered, but it no longer spoke for itself. It had to be connected to purpose, legitimacy, and understanding. Without those, power risked becoming performative rather than transformative. The phrase that defines the war captures this transformation precisely. The United States won most of the battles, but lost the war. This is not a contradiction. It is a description of two different dimensions of conflict colliding. Battles belong to the realm of tactics. Wars belong to the realm of meaning. Vietnam revealed the danger of confusing one for the other. History did not judge the Vietnam War with a single verdict. Instead, it absorbed it as a lesson written in complexity. The war reshaped doctrines, humbled assumptions, and left behind questions that can continue to resonate. It taught that power is not merely the ability to act, but the ability to shape outcomes that endure. It taught that endurance can rival dominance. It taught that understanding may matter as much as strength. In the end, Vietnam did not strip the United States of its power. It stripped it of its illusions. And in doing so, it changed how power would be understood in the modern world. The war remains a reminder that history is not decided solely by those who win the most battles, but by those who understand what the conflict is truly about.